Well, we're back again, and I want to continue the previous discussion that we had about the mailer that we sent out and received 750 pieces back. That mailer was sent out based on a list of potential voters that we got from the county clerk. And what I want to get into today is the vote that took place after we did the mailing. One of the things that led up to even the desire to run was the fact that we didn't see anyone who was interested in running against several people that held office in Nye County. The clerk, the treasurer, the assessor, the recorder. In essence, there was going to be no contest. And it's always been my belief that if you're going to have an election, there should always be a discussion about the issues. Whether you win or whether you lose, the thing that's more important is the discussion, because somebody has to decide what they're going to do when they get elected. And it also gives you a chance to measure the pulse of the public. Now, maybe that pulse isn't always what you wanted to see, but that's what we like to do. So one of the things that happened was that a candidate that was running for office, Dennis Hoff, was holding a birthday party at the local casino, at the Nugget to be specific. And the next morning it was discovered he died during the night, sometime. During the campaigns, which is rather odd. We're still waiting on the autopsy report for that. And the second thing that happened was that of the four offices that I mentioned, one of the people who was running ran against a slate of some other Republicans, and she prevailed and got the most votes. And it was thought at that time, when she got enough votes, that she was a shoo-in because there was nobody else running against her after that, except the members of the Independent American Party had put up a candidate, a fellow named Lance Roy Schaus, to run in the general election. Now, state law in Nevada says that if you're a minority party, you're not allowed to run in a primary. Personally, I see that as a benefit, but that's the way the law is written. So everybody thought that when she got elected that the deal was done. But it wasn't, because Lance was a candidate running in the general election against the treasurer, who had been appointed to the position, had never been elected to it. And so there was that race that now was going to be contested, and the other three offices were being contested by members of the Independent American Party who filed for their campaigns, each one not having to run in the primary. So as it got into the race, along around, I think it was September, Pam Webster, who was the appointed candidate, if you will, for treasurer, resigned. Gave notice and then resigned was out of the office in beginning of October, and the county commissioners appointed someone to take her place until January, when either she would be elected or not. Now, when I say either she could be elected, the fact that she resigned didn't take her name off the ballot, because the only time you can take your name off the ballot is within 2 weeks after the close of the filing date to run. Well, this was so far beyond that here's an unusual situation. The person resigned, she's still on the ballot. If she gets elected, she has a choice as to whether she wants to take the office again or not. Now, she had retired twice already, and it was a shocker when she came in to be the appointed treasurer. So now, if she decides not to take the position, the person who would take that place would be appointed by the county commissioners. In essence, eliminating the need for another vote. And it just seems to me that this seems to happen a little too often in government these days, where people are appointed to positions and then run for office as the apparent incumbent, even though they aren't an incumbent, they're merely the office holder, but that's what it looks like to the general public. So there was that issue that came up also. So when the whole race was done, Lance came up to me, Lance Schaus, who was the treasurer candidate, came up to me because of the amount of votes that he got, and he had expected he would do better. So we got to looking at the way votes came in on all of the races. And that's what I want to talk about today. This is one of the most unusual things I have ever seen in a race for any office. And I've run for a different office before, but I've never really looked closely at the votes. There have been instances where people have complained about the county clerk in the way she conducted the elections. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to get into the weeds on that one yet. But so what we had here was something's unusual, something I never expected to see, nor did anybody else. And that's what I want to talk about. By the way, I have a personal belief that career politicians are the problem in government these days. It's my belief that the employees who work as employees in government can have careers, but I don't think it was ever intended that elected officials should have a career in politics. And here's what happens. You know, we've heard that there's term limits. I can only tell you that my impression of term limits is this. Once they've reached a limit in the term that they're in, they can just go run for a different office and that term limit starts all over again. To me, that's not really term limits. That's a joke on the public. And you hear the public talk about term limits. But in reality, these are career politicians who just want to stay in office and maintain their career and their income and their retirement from being a politician. And if you look at it, some of the benefits being honored to, maybe bestowed is a better word, upon politicians who have careers are pretty substantial. And there's an organization out of Nevada called Transparent Nevada. Well, that's not their name. It's NPRI is the acronym, Nevada Policy Research Institute. Anyway, they went to court to force government agencies to publish not only the salaries and benefits of employees who we pay for as the taxpayers, plus their retirement benefits when they retire. That could be a whole nother video, and probably we'll get into that someday after these other issues are looked at. So here we are now, the election is over. It was something unusual that happened with Lance, and this is one of the reasons he came to me as the party chairman. And he said, you know, Andy, my votes were never published along with everyone else's on the state website. He said, and I went in to look when he told me about it, and sure enough, at 9 o'clock at night, everybody's numbers were being posted on the state website, but not the treasurer's race. As a matter of fact, a friend who was a Democrat had got up at 2 in the morning to look and see what had happened, and it still hadn't been posted. And yet everybody else's numbers had been posted. And I know for a fact that the county clerk actually had figures that could have been posted, but they were not. It's too coincidental that the race was between somebody who had resigned their position, who could be reelected. that was the only race not published. There's another anomaly as well. When you look at the votes that are tallied for every politician that ran, and in some races there were uh, three people running, or four people in some races, and they always tallied the amount of votes totaling 100% of the tally. And what they would have is a red and a green bar on each side, and it's a horizontal bar, and it would show the percentage of each person's vote. And in between those two bars would be a gray section, which would show the amount of votes split between the rest of the candidates. If there weren't other candidates, but there was a choice of none of the above, it showed how many none of the above votes were cast. The odd thing about Lance Schaus and Pam Webster's candidacies and results were that they didn't show 100% of the votes between the two runners. There was a big gray bar in the middle, but there was no figure to show 100% of the votes being tallied. So with that, we decided we would take a look at just what happened. Why is it that his votes were so different from everybody else's? So now I'm back. The sun is set in the west, and we have full use of the studio. So what I wanted to show you on that voting is that this is state offices. And what I did is, in Nye County, I only looked at Nye County's voting for this portion. I looked at, there were 11, I've got that number up here, there were 11 races that we looked at that had figures that were in the 10,000 range. So the low count was 10,733, and the high count was 11,810. Out of all those races, and this is the list here. Maybe just put it up there. So this is the list right here. And out of that list, I could only find one winner that had a 6. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that. I'm looking for it. There was no winner in that race that had a 6 in the total as the last digit. So there were a couple of 7s, there were some 2s, but out of all those, there was not a 6. So now I want to go a step further, and I'll pull this up here, be a little easier to see. Yeah, if you can see that. These are the numbers that occurred for the winners in the different races for Nye County offices. That's the treasurer, the clerk, the assessor, the recorder, and this is Dennis Hoff down here. So if you look at these numbers, this is what I found interesting. They all ended in a 6. 2 of the races, well actually 3 races, ended in 96, 1 in 86, and 2 of the races ended in 12,796 and 12,796. That is just a little too coincidental for my blood. So we talked to a mathematician at the men's breakfast, and we asked if he would go through the numbers to show us what the probability is that some of these things could happen. Now, there were a total of, well, I can't give you an exact number, but we know there were at least 15,112 votes that could have been cast. And actually, there were more than votes than that cast, and I will get to that a bit later. But I want to get to the probability here. What is the probability that 3 of these races out of over 10,000 numbers that could be picked could end in 6? According to our mathematician who did the work, that number is 1 in a million. So we said, well, listen, there's another probability question we have here. We have 2 races ending in 12,796 and 12,796. What's the odds of that happening? What's the probability of those numbers coming to play? And when he ran the numbers, he told us the probability of that happening out of 12,000 numbers coming up with those digits is 1 in 100 million. Now, those are not my numbers. Those are the numbers from the fellow that we used who was a mathematics instructor. So I don't know what to think of this. None of the other races that I showed you in my list even come close to anything like that. Let me see where that is. Even come close to anything like that. And yet here in 4 races, we've got these oddball things going on. And in fact, the treasurer's race wasn't even posted until sometime the next morning on the state race level. Now, here's what I understand, and if I'm wrong, somebody can correct me on this. But my understanding is that the county clerk, the board, counts the votes. She then runs them through a machine mechanically, taking a cartridge from each of the automatic machines, and comes up with the totals. The totals that occur on election day are added to the totals that came in through early voting and absentee voting to get these numbers. And it's my understanding that when the machines are set up for voting, the clerk herself sets up the machines. And I was told by someone who used to work for her that she does it without another employee being there for observing. And I've always been uncomfortable with the fact that we have early voting. And this is what bothers me about early voting. The machines sit there for 10 days, actually 12 days, well, more than that even. And during that period of time, you vote during the day, and then they're locked up at night. Well, if they're locked up at night, how secure can those machines be? Or can somebody get in there and tamper with them? And I don't care if you put a piece of tape over the door that says secure or whatever it says. Those machines sit there for easily 10 days, all during voting. The opportunity to play games with programming. There's only one thing I can think when I look at these numbers here, and that's that maybe somebody got into the program, made some changes, and because they had some errors in the way the calculations would run, that through a quirk in the mistake, all these numbers came up like you see. So I wrote to the chairman for the party for the state, and I asked him to contact the Secretary of State's office to talk about this, and the fact that even today, if you go look on the state website, today is November 26th. If you go look at it on the state website today, you'll still see that the votes for Lance Schaus that were calculated, there's that big gray space that's not included in the totals, and they don't show 100% of the votes. I still think that has to be a calculating error, and it has to be done in the program. Either that or somebody just threw some numbers out there, but I don't think that's the case. So I would like to see the Attorney General for the state of Nevada come into Nye County and bring along somebody from the factory that, or the distributor, or whoever it is that sells us these machines, to look at the program to see how this could happen. I'd also like to find a hacker, somebody who understands how to hack into these machines. And boy, they're out there. There was a hacker convention in Vegas, and in that convention, they had a contest to hack into these voting machines. 11 minutes, they could be hacked. So I think we should have one of them come out, maybe two, and look at the program. And let's see what we find. I have no fear to look at it, and I think it should be encouraged. What's coming up now, the next step is that once the county clerk, Sandra Molino, has certified all the figures, she takes them to the county commissioners, and then they approve of the report that she provides. I'm going to ask the county commissioners not to certify this portion of the vote until an investigation is done to find out how this could happen. Now, I'm not a stranger to losing an election, and I'm not a stranger to winning them either. But what I do think this is an oddball thing to happen. And the fact that it did happen needs to be investigated. We hear so often that the activists that live in Nye County have an extreme distrust about the way the county clerk has calculated the votes. Even doing a recount. I had one instance where I had a recount because I lost an election by 2 votes. And I wanted to see actually the tapes that are in the machine. I wanted to be able to verify that every vote that was in there was eligible to vote, and also wanted to see the absentee ballots. So when I had, the person that was with me was Dave Richards, who was the town manager at the time, and the answer I got was this: well, really you can't do that. It would cost a lot more money. And so I said, well, we're not getting a true recount then. And she said, well, that's the minimum that I have to do according to state law. And I said, well, what are my options? And we discussed it. And I asked her a question about, why I couldn't see the absentee ballots. And she said, it's our policy. And I said, well, I'd like to read the policy. At which point she said, well, you can't read it. The policy is up here. I don't know what to say about that other than I was rather shocked, and so was Dave Richards when he heard that. Anyway, we keep talking about the integrity of voting. And if you have 7,000 people who their addresses have changed and they're probably not going to vote, there's an opportunity here to somebody to cast their votes for them. I saved all those returned letters, which is only a small portion of what I think would have been returned had I done a 29 or 30,000 piece mailing. So we'll wait and see what happens. But I think as a citizen voting, you should have a right to expect the integrity of the count. And from what I showed you today, I think there were some real questions. So with that, we have another segment that we're going to do, and it's on a different portion of this whole episode of the vote. And it has to do with candidates not being allowed in the voting area. So we'll be back in with a segment 3 on that story.